The night Gideon Rourke walked into the Magnolia Grill, the rain was coming down so hard, it sounded like the sky was trying to break through the roof. He didn't belong there. Anyone in that diner could tell you that without thinking twice. The man was wearing a suit that cost more than most of the regulars made in a year, his jaw set like concrete, two men flanking him like shadows that had learned to walk upright. He slid into the corner booth, the one the staff called the Island, because nobody ever sat there, and he didn't pick up the menu, he just watched. Now, you might be wondering what a man like Gideon Rourke was doing in a 24-hour diner in the soggy underbelly of New Orleans at 11:47 on a Wednesday night. That's exactly the right question. And the answer starts with a girl who had no idea she was about to become the most important person and the most dangerous man in Louisiana. Her name was Waverly Oakes, 22 years old, 5'4" in her work shoes, which had a crack along the left sole that she'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. She'd worked the closing shift at the Magnolia Grill for 4 years, which meant she knew every sticky spot on the linoleum, every customer who ordered decaf but always asked for a refill at 2 a.m., and every shortcut between the kitchen and the booths that saved her exactly 47 steps per hour. She did not know Gideon Rourke. She did not know what he ran, or how many men answered to him, or why half of New Orleans' underworld went quiet when his name came up in conversation. What she knew was that his table needed coffee, and that the man in the booth by the window, old Mr. Thibault, who came in every Wednesday and ordered the same chicken pot pie, had just knocked his napkin onto the floor. She picked up Mr. Thibault's napkin first. That small decision, that little pause, that 20-second detour, is the reason Waverly Oakes is alive today. If you're new here, welcome to Rosie's Romance Library. Hit that like button if you love stories where fate works in ways that don't make sense until the very end. Now let's get into it. Waverly brought coffee to the corner booth without being asked. She set it down without spilling a drop, which was harder than it sounds given that the floor near that booth had a slight tilt nobody'd ever bothered to fix. "Anything else to start?" she asked. The man closest to her, broad-shaved head, the kind of neck that suggested he'd played football and then kept lifting, said, "We're fine." She nodded and turned to go. "Wait." The voice came from the man in the center, low, not loud, but the kind of voice that expected to be heard. Waverly turned back. Gideon Rourke was looking at the floor near the booth, not at her, at the floor. "You dropped something," he said. She looked down, a folded piece of paper, half tucked under the edge of the booth's base. She picked it up, a receipt, hers, from the supply order she'd run during her break. She'd been carrying it in her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said. He still wasn't looking at her. He was watching the window, the rain, something beyond both. She walked away. She did not think about him again for the next 40 minutes, because the kitchen was backed up. Table 6 had sent back the gumbo twice, and a family of 5 had just walked in 10 minutes before last call. What Waverly did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that the man in the corner booth had watched her for those entire 40 minutes, that he had noticed the crack in her left shoe, that he had noticed the way she retied her apron between the kitchen door and the pass-through every single time, a habit so ingrained she probably didn't know she did it, that he had noticed, when she picked up Mr. Thibault's napkin, that she'd said something to the old man that made him laugh. Gideon Rourke had not laughed in a long time. He had almost forgotten what it looked like on someone else. He was still watching when the door to the kitchen swung open, not with a server, but with a man who had no business being in a diner kitchen. Polo shirt, wrong shoes for the weather, eyes moving too fast. Gideon saw him before either of his men did. He was out of the booth before either of them registered why. What happened in the next 4 minutes is the kind of thing that sounds impossible when you describe it later. Gideon Rourke crossed the length of the diner in under 6 seconds. The man from the kitchen had a hand on Waverly's arm, not violent yet, but the kind of grip that was getting there. She was saying calmly, "Sir, I need you to let go," in the same tone she probably used on customers who'd had too much to drink somewhere else before coming in. Gideon said one word. The man let go. He was also 3 inches off the ground at the time, but that's a detail that doesn't need elaborating. The 2 shadow men had the situation handled in a way that involved no police, no noise, and a back exit that Waverly had not previously noticed existed on that side of the building. The man in the polo shirt was gone. The kitchen staff had somehow not witnessed anything. The family of 5 was still debating the kids' menu. Waverly looked at Gideon Rourke. "Who was that?" she asked. "Nobody who'll bother you again." "That's not an answer." He looked at her then. Really looked, for the first time. She had flour on her left cuff from someone else's table order, and she was holding her order pad like she might need it as a weapon, which suggested she had more nerve than most people he dealt with professionally. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He went back to the corner booth. She stood there for a moment, then walked to the coffee station, refilled the pot that didn't need refilling, and gave herself 10 seconds to stop her hands from shaking. Then she walked back to table 6. She found the card on the corner booth after they left. Not a business card, nothing with a name or a title or a company logo. Just a phone number, handwritten, and below it 2 words, "if needed." She stared at it for a long time. Then she tucked it into the same apron pocket as the supply receipt. She did not call it, not that night. Not the night after, when she walked to her car and felt certain, the kind of certain that lives in the back of your neck, that someone was watching the parking lot. Not even the night, 3 days later, when she found her car with a flat tire that had a neat, clean puncture that did not look like a nail. What finally made her call was the afternoon she came home to her apartment to find her front door unlocked. She never left her front door unlocked. She had a system. She checked it twice every time. Left hand on the knob, right hand on the deadbolt, and the door was not just unlocked but slightly ajar. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved as far as she could tell, but on her kitchen counter, in the exact center, was a photograph. It was a picture of a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark braids and a gap-toothed smile. She was sitting on a porch step. The photograph was printed on regular paper, not glossy, and the image quality suggested it had been pulled from a security camera or a phone taken at distance. Waverly did not recognize the girl, but the porch steps in the background, the specific slant of them, the wrought iron railing with the bend at the second post, she recognized those. That was the porch of the house 2 blocks over. She had walked past it 100 times. Whoever left this photograph had been watching her neighborhood, and they were telling her they knew it too. She called the number. He answered on the second ring. "I wondered when you'd call," Gideon Rourke said. "There was a photo in my apartment," Waverly said. She kept her voice steady, "of a little girl near my neighborhood. Someone left it." A pause. Not the pause of someone surprised, the pause of someone recalibrating. "Don't touch it," he said. "Don't move anything. I'll have someone there in 12 minutes. I don't need someone. I need to know what's going on." Another pause. Longer. "You do need to know," he said, "and I'll tell you, but not on the phone. Can you leave the apartment right now?" "Yes, the coffee shop on Prytania, the one with the green awning. Go there. Order something. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She went. She ordered a black coffee she didn't drink. He arrived in 18 minutes, alone this time, no shadows. He sat across from her in a booth near the window. Different diner, same corner positioning, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked like a man trying to figure out how to say something he hadn't planned to say. "The man at the diner," he said. "He wasn't there for you. Then why was he touching me? Because you were the nearest person to where he was headed. He was going to use you as leverage to get through to the kitchen." He paused. "The kitchen, specifically the walk-in freezer, where one of my people had just gone." Waverly said nothing. She was building a picture that she did not entirely want to finish. "He was sent by someone I've been dealing with for about 8 months, Gideon continued. "A man named Breckett, Philip Breckett. He runs distribution up and down the river. Not food, not freight, other things. And you're in competition with him." "I was in the process of ending his operation," Gideon said. "Legally, where possible. Otherwise." He stopped. "He's been looking for pressure points, ways to slow me down, and I became a pressure point. You became visible," he said, "because I stopped at your diner, because I handled the situation in front of witnesses instead of walking away. That was my error. I put attention on you, and now Breckett's people have taken notice." Waverly wrapped both hands around the coffee cup she wasn't drinking. "So that photograph," she said, "is a message. To me, through you. To let me know they've been watching and they're not afraid to get close. His jaw tightened. They shouldn't have done that. She looked at him. Why do you care? You don't know me. You stopped at my diner one time. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she thought I wasn't going to answer. Because I know what it looks like when someone's being set up to get hurt because of something that has nothing to do with them, he finally said. And I know what it looks like when the people who should do something about it don't. There was something in the way he said it, not rehearsed, not careful. The way most things he said seemed to be. That told her it wasn't about her at all. It was about something older than her. Something he was still carrying. She didn't ask what. Not yet. His name, it turned out, was known to most of New Orleans in the vague, careful way that powerful names are known. You've heard it. You're not sure exactly where. You know better than to ask too many questions about it. Gideon Rourke had run the Rourke organization for 11 years, since his father, Thomas Rourke, had died in what the official record called a boating accident on Lake Pontchartrain, and what every person south of Baton Rouge understood was something else entirely. He was 39 years old. He had no wife, no children. He had a house in the Garden District with a garden that, according to the woman who tended it, he'd never once been seen to walk through. He gave money to 3 different children's organizations anonymously. He had not been charged with anything in 6 years, which either meant he was clean or meant he was very good. Waverly learned most of this, not from him but from her co-worker Patrice, who had grown up 3 streets over from the Rourke family home and had approximately 17 years of neighborhood gossip stored in her memory, like a library that had never been audited. Why are you asking about Rourke? Patrice had said, handing Waverly the salt shakers to refill. He was in the diner, Waverly said. Patrice had given her a look. Honey, lots of people come into this diner. You don't research all of them. Waverly refilled the salt shakers and said nothing. What she was actually thinking about was the thing he'd said. I know what it looks like when someone's being set up to get hurt because of something that has nothing to do with them. The flatness of it, the exhaustion underneath the flatness. She was thinking about it when her phone buzzed with an unknown number, not Gideon's number. Different. The text said, he can't protect you and keep his hands clean. Ask him what happened to the girl on Burgundy Street. She stared at it for a long time. Then she called Gideon. Someone just texted me, she said when he picked up. An unknown number. They mentioned a girl on Burgundy Street. The silence on the other end was different from his other silences. This one had weight. Where are you? He said. Still at work. I have another hour. Don't leave alone. I'll have someone outside when your shift ends, Gideon. She'd used his first name without meaning to. What happened on Burgundy Street? Another silence. Then, I'll tell you tonight. I should have told you before. She learned it in his car, parked 2 blocks from the diner. Rain coming down again. This city and its rain, with the engine running, and both of them looking at the windshield instead of each other. 7 years ago, there had been a girl. Not a romantic connection, not what Waverly had briefly, uncomfortably braced for. A 14-year-old named Delia, the daughter of a woman who had worked for the Rourke organization in the accounting side. Legitimate accounting, the above-board architecture that any operation needed. Her mother, Helen, had found something in the books she wasn't supposed to find. Something that implicated not Gideon, but someone within his organization who had been running a secondary operation without his knowledge. She'd come to Gideon. He'd told her he'd handle it. He'd told her she was safe. He had been wrong. The man inside his organization, a man named Cutler, who had since answered for what he did in a way that required no courtroom, had gotten to Helen before Gideon could. Helen had survived, barely. Delia had not been physically harmed, but she had spent 2 nights terrified and alone in an apartment that Cutler's people had locked down before Gideon's people found her. 2 nights. Gideon had been 26 hours too late. Delia was fine now, as far as he knew. Helen had left the city. He'd made sure they had what they needed to start over somewhere else. But the 2 nights, the window he'd missed, was something he had not, in 7 years, put down. Brackett's people found out about it, Gideon said. They're using it as a threat, suggesting that I failed her, that I'll fail you, that you shouldn't trust me. Should I? He turned to look at her then, and the rain on the windshield threw broken light across his face, and he looked, for just a moment, like a man instead of whatever category she'd been unconsciously putting him in. "I don't know," he said. "That's an honest answer. I think you're safer near me than away from me right now. I also think that being near me carries its own risk, and I'm not going to tell you otherwise." Waverly looked at her hands in her lap. "The girl in the photograph," she said. "The one in my apartment. Who is she?" A beat. "I don't know," he said, and something in his voice shifted. The careful architecture dropped, just briefly. "But she's about 8 years old and she has dark braids, and that photograph was taken on your street, which means Brackett's people have been on your street." His voice tightened. "I need to know if you have anyone. Family nearby. Someone who might be." "No," Waverly said. "It's just me." He nodded slowly. "Then I need you to consider staying somewhere else for a few days." She thought about her apartment, the unlocked door, the photograph in the center of the counter, positioned there by someone who had walked through her home while she was gone. "Okay," she said. Here's what Gideon Rourke did not tell Waverly Oaks that night, because he did not yet know it himself. The photograph was not a threat. It was a message of a different kind entirely. The little girl with the dark braids was named Nell, but not the Nell on his list of names to track, not an operative or a plant. She was 8 years old, and she lived 2 blocks from Waverly's apartment, and she had been photographed not by Brackett's surveillance, but by someone else. Someone who had been watching the situation from a distance that Gideon's considerable resources had not yet mapped. Her name, the little girl's last name, was Rourke, not from him, from his brother. Callum Rourke had left New Orleans 14 years ago, at 22, after a disagreement with their father that had burned a bridge most of the family assumed was permanent. Gideon had heard from him twice in the intervening years. Once when their father died, a 2-line message. Once 4 years ago, a phone number that stopped working within a week. What Gideon did not know, what no one in the organization knew, because Callum had spent 14 years making sure no one knew, was that Callum had a daughter. That Callum had, for the last 3 years, been feeding information to a federal task force investigating Philip Brackett's operation, and that Callum had known, for 6 months, that Brackett had figured out who his informant was. Callum had put his daughter near Waverly Oaks' street on purpose, because he had been watching Gideon, because he'd seen Gideon stop at the Magnolia Grill, because he'd seen how Gideon had handled the situation with the man from the kitchen, because, after 14 years, a man will look at his brother from a distance and try to determine whether the person he became is someone who can be trusted with the most important thing he has left. The photograph was not a threat. It was a test and an introduction. It was Waverly who found her. She'd been staying in a guest suite on the 3rd floor of a building on St. Charles that belonged to Gideon, which she'd agreed to with approximately 6 times more calm than she felt about it. 3 days in, she'd developed the habit of taking a walk in the early morning before the heat solidified. 6 blocks, same route, back before 9. On the 4th morning, there was a child sitting on the bottom step of a wrought iron staircase on the corner, in the kind of stillness that children only achieve when they're very tired or very scared. Dark braids, gap-toothed, though the gap had mostly grown in since the photograph. She had a backpack on her lap that she was holding with both arms. Waverly stopped. "Hey," she said. "Are you okay?" The little girl looked up at her. She had her father's eyes, though Waverly didn't know that yet, gray-green and unsettlingly direct. "Are you Waverly?" the girl said. The back of Waverly's neck went the particular cold it had been going several times in the past week. "I am," she said carefully. "Who told you my name?" "My dad," the girl said. "He said if I got separated I should find you. He said you were kind." Waverly crouched down to the girl's eye level. "What's your name?" "Nell what?" The girl looked at her with those gray-green eyes. "Rourke," she said. Gideon arrived at the building in 11 minutes, which Waverly suspected was a new record. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room and looked at the girl, who was eating the granola bar Waverly had found in her bag, and something moved across his face that had nothing to do with the careful, controlled version of him that Waverly had come to understand was the default. "Callum," he said, quietly. Not a question. Nell looked up. "You're my uncle." "I am," he said, and his voice did something complicated. "Where is your dad?" "He said he'd find me," she said. "He said he just needed to do one thing first and then he'd find me." She looked back at the granola bar. "He's been saying that for 2 days." The 2 days landed in the room the way those words always land when a child says them, with the weight of every hour they contain. Gideon looked at Waverly. She looked back at him. "I'll make more calls," he said. It took him 36 hours. What Callum Rourke had been doing, the one thing, was meeting with his federal contact to hand over a final set of documents that completed the case against Philip Breckett. The meeting had been compromised. Callum had known it was compromised going in. He had gone anyway, because without those final documents, the case collapsed. And Breckett walked free, and the 8-year-old girl with the dark braids would spend the rest of her childhood in witness protection or worse. Callum was in a hospital in Baton Rouge when Gideon found him. Alive, which had not been guaranteed, with 2 cracked ribs and a concussion, and a federal agent sitting outside his room. The case documents had made it. Breckett had been arrested 4 hours earlier. Gideon sat next to his brother's bed for a long time without saying anything. "I should have come back," Callum said finally. His voice was rough. "Yeah," Gideon said. I didn't know what you'd become." "I know. Are you angry?" Gideon thought about the past 3 days. The girl on the staircase, holding her backpack with both arms. Waverly crouched to her eye level. He said you were kind, and the fact that Callum had been watching from a distance long enough to know something true about a woman Gideon had barely acknowledged knowing. "No," he said, and he meant it, which surprised him. The charges against Breckett held. It took 4 months to go from arrest to indictment, and Gideon's lawyers were involved in exactly none of it, because for once the work had been done without him, and it had been done right. Waverly went back to the Magnolia Grill. She got the crack in her left shoe fixed, finally. She started taking the morning walk on St. Charles as a deliberate habit, rather than a temporary one, because it turned out that Nell's school was 12 blocks that direction, and the girl had developed the habit of stopping at the corner where they'd first met and waiting to walk the last 4 blocks with her. "You don't have to do that," Waverly told her. "I know," Nell said. "I want to." Gideon watched this from the passenger window of a car he was being driven in on a morning, when his route happened to take him down St. Charles, which happened more frequently than could reasonably be called a coincidence. He was not a man who believed in coincidences. He also was not, as he had been demonstrating to himself with increasing frequency, a man who was particularly good at staying away from things that had somehow become important to him without his permission. He had his driver stop the car. There is a moment in some stories, the ones that are really about something, where the impossible thing has already happened, and what's left is the part where the people involved decide whether they're going to acknowledge it. Gideon Rourke stood on St. Charles Avenue in the early morning with the Garden District going gold around him, and a child with his brother's eyes walking ahead with a woman who had flour on her cuff and a crack in her shoe that was now, he noticed, fixed, and he thought about 7 years of a weight he'd been carrying and how strangely light the last 4 months had felt. He caught up to them at the corner. Nell looked up at him. She'd been around him enough by now that the instinctive caution most people showed had been replaced by something more like territorial assessment. "You're early," she said. "I was in the area." She gave him the gray-green look. "You're always in the area." Waverly was watching him with the expression she'd developed, the one that was not quite amusement and not quite something else, but something that lived in the space between the two. "Walk with us," she said. It wasn't a question, it was an offer, which was different, and he knew the difference. "Yeah," he said. And the three of walked blocks to the school in the New Orleans morning, and the city went on around them the way cities do, loud and alive and entirely indifferent, and Gideon Rourke thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the most dangerous moments of his life had rarely involved guns or enemies or rooms full of men who meant him harm. The most dangerous moments were the ones like this, the ones where something was offered and you had to decide whether you were brave enough to take it. He was still deciding, but he was still walking. "Before I let you go, what moment hit you hardest? Was it Nell on that staircase or the walk at the end?" Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're new here, subscribe to Rosie's Romance Library because we are just getting started.